The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A New York Times blockbuster raising even more questions about the timing as well as the motivation for Donald Trump's sudden firing of James Comey, the FBI director. Days before the firing of Comey, which was about 48 hours ago, James Comey went to the Justice Department to ask for more money for the investigation into Trump-Russia collusion. According to multiple congressional officials, including Senator Dick Durbin, the Justice Department is run by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who, after lying about multiple meetings with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, said he would be recusing himself from anything relating to Russia. This is the same Jeff Sessions who, according to the letter from Trump explaining the firing of James Comey, recommended that James Comey be fired. Red alert, we need an independent prosecutor. The guy who said, Jeff Sessions, that he would not get involved in anything Russia-related because he lied about Russian meetings, is the same guy running the department that was asked for more money to investigate his boss, Trump and Russia, and then was cited as the person who recommended the firing of the person running the investigation. And adding to the strange circumstances is that the Department of Justice is saying, oh, Comey asked for more money? No, those reports are totally false, which to believe at this point would require believing that there's yet another conspiracy to concoct lies out of thin air, which is a bit too big of a pill to swallow right now.
And now Ron Wyden, who is a Democratic senator from Oregon, is calling for the resignation of Jeff Sessions because he promised the country he was going to stay out of this Russia probe.
Yep.
We do need a special prosecutor. Only problem with that is that would have to go through Congress, and then Trump would have to sign off on it.
Yeah.
So that's a big task, getting through a Republican Congress, and then the guy who has the investigation against him would have to sign off on that. I don't see that happening.
It's a closed loop. It's a totally closed loop of lack of independence. And obviously, the timing of the money requests alone isn't proof that the firing of Comey was about Russia. The recommendation from Jeff Sessions isn't proof. The fact that Comey was going to testify today about Trump-Russia isn't proof. The Sally Yates testimony on Monday blowing the story wide open, it's not proof. None of it's proof. But it all looks pretty damn bad. I guess it's just all coincidence, Pat. These are just mere coincidences.
Oh, yeah. The Trump team asserts that this had nothing to do with the Russia probe. It was entirely because of James Comey's treatment of Hillary Clinton and the email investigation, circumventing the chain of command. It was all that stuff.
Who could believe that at this point? Who could believe that? Only the most committed ideologue. And anyone expecting James Comey's firing to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, don't be so sure. There are people all over the media congratulating Trump on the firing. Turn on Fox News, Sean Hannity talking about just how great it is. This is all an insult to the intelligence of clear-thinking people. But lots of Trumpists still don't want to see the obvious. And I believe we are maybe going to see an avalanche of leaks and leakers starting very soon. When will the country be up in arms about this? This is a good time. I read this morning about some protests demanding an investigation into the firing of James Comey itself. Smoking gun we talk about. There are smoking guns after smoking guns. It's resembling Nixon more and more. And what we have to remember here is that if Trump is impeached, which is not looking particularly likely given who would have to start that impeachment process, if Mike Pence becomes the president, it will get really boring and arguably as a result more damaging to the country because of all the things Mike Pence would be able to do as a committed right-wing ideologue that would not make headlines in the way that Trump's craziness makes headlines.
That's true, and possibly, we're going down the road here, but if Donald Trump gets impeached, it's not too far off to think that Mike Pence would as well, because Pence joined the Trump campaign in July. You'd have to think there'd be some overlap there with the Russia ties.
There's no doubt that Pence is just as involved in the Russia stuff and knows about it as anybody else. But in the hypothetical, you have to at least consider the possibility that Mike Pence becomes president of the U.S. Let's talk about James Comey and his testimony. Now, as you know, James Comey was fired as FBI director. He was scheduled to testify today, Thursday, as current FBI director. That's been canceled, which means that the firing of James Comey has already had an immediate impact on the investigation into Russia. However, we have now learned that James Comey has been asked to testify as a private citizen just a day after being fired by Donald Trump. Reports said that the Senate Intelligence Committee's chairman, Richard Burr, a Republican, and Democratic ranking member Mark Warner said that they had asked Mr. Comey to appear before the committee next Tuesday as a private citizen. It wasn't immediately clear whether Comey would or wouldn't accept the invitation, whether this would be open or closed. Here's Mark Warner explaining what's going on.
Chairman Burr and I sent out a joint request to former Director Comey to appear before Senate Intel next Tuesday, May 16th. We've not heard back. We just sent out the letter this morning. As you know, he was scheduled to testify before the committee tomorrow, along with all the other heads of the intelligence community.
Yeah.
And so my hope is that he'll take advantage of this opportunity.
I don't know whether James Comey will or will not testify next week, but I damn well hope that he has a good security detail in place. The last thing we need, Pat, is James Comey accidentally stabbing himself in the back 10 times and then poisoning himself.
Right, that could possibly happen. I mean, if James Comey does testify, I think he would conduct himself professionally. It's not like he would be throwing bombshells left and right.
Yeah.
Part of that is because I'm sure he would have to keep some things confidential, but also because he just wouldn't see that as the right thing to do. But if there were things that he was on the fence on when it comes to speaking about those topics, I think he would be more likely to just let them go.
That's my sense. I mean, either way, Comey can tell his story, and I'm guessing that the Trump administration, what I mean is, as FBI director or as former FBI director, Comey can talk to people, right? My thought would be the Trump administration calculated that having Comey telling the story as a disgruntled outsider is not as bad as having him do it as the sitting FBI director. He's also easier to write off as this is just a disgruntled guy. But there is a difference between testifying as a private citizen and former FBI director than as the current FBI director. Number one, as a former FBI director, he would no longer have access to the up-to-the-minute knowledge of what the FBI has, right? He would also be more free to give personal opinions. As Pat is pointing out, it doesn't mean he's going to violate confidentiality or spill secret information, but at least when asked, what's your personal characterization of this? He would no longer need to hide behind, as FBI director, it would be inappropriate for me to give my personal opinion. He could just give it.
And also, I don't think his career is going to go much further than where he's been at. I mean, it's not like he's going to be attorney general when the next administration comes around. Yeah. So it's like he has nothing to lose. In
terms of calculations, though, Trump probably also calculated, or you would imagine, although how much Trump calculates is anyone's guess, you would imagine that Trump knew there would be some uproar over firing Comey, but that the uproar over firing Comey would be not as bad as the uproar over whatever Comey and his FBI investigation were getting close to. How Donald Trump has dug himself such a huge hole with such tiny hands is a mystery that I don't know that we're going to solve anytime soon. I wonder if Trump legitimately thought that maybe firing Comey would prevent him from playing any further part in the investigation. I can imagine Trump seeing that now James Comey might testify anyway and asking his aides, how is it possible I fired the guy?
It doesn't seem like Trump thought that this would have the effect that it's had, because maybe in his mind he thought James Comey is disliked by both Democrats and Republicans, so no one's really going to care.
But respected by both as well in other ways, and that's where I think the backfire came. We're going to follow it. We'll see what happens next Tuesday. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. Follow the show on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And follow me on Instagram at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is William Brooks. William, thank you for subscribing at davidpakman.com/membership. This is independent, non-corporate funded media. We're mostly funded by members like William. You can join William and sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. You can use the coupon code I voted 17. We've got a big membership special that we're going to email everybody on our newsletter about tomorrow, Friday. Just sign up for our newsletter at davidpakman.com to be notified about that. You can also go to davidpakman.com/gear, pick up bumper stickers, t-shirts, zip-up hoodies, as well as coffee. And speaking of coffee, our friend Greg Stevens, longtime supporter, big friend of the show, Greg Stevens, is producing a documentary, and it's about globalization and agriculture and trade. and farming and so many other issues through the lens of coffee. And they're actually in the middle of a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo. You can learn more about it and contribute if you want. I think it's just such a great project. Loveinthetimeofcoffee.com is the website. Check that out. Really, really great project that I'd love to have our audience help with. Let's get into what's happening on our Reddit discussion forum. davidpakman.com/Reddit. We've got at this point, what is it? Close to 3,500 of our viewers and listeners, I think, that are subscribed there. Discussions about all sorts of political issues going on. davidpakman.com/Reddit. Let's take a look at a couple interesting posts on our Reddit that I found this morning. Number one, an interesting post about Glenn Greenwald supporting a relationship between Russia and Donald Trump related to an interview he did on Democracy Now! Very interesting discussion. I encourage you to check it out. Also on our Reddit discussion forum, an article about long dormant bacteria and viruses trapped in ice and permafrost for centuries that are reviving as we have the climate of Earth warming. Also on our Reddit discussion forum, is everyone a Marxist and not willing to admit it? Interesting little hypothesis put together by one of our audience members, and a nice little discussion happening about that. Also on our Reddit discussion forum, Steve Eggman made my day. This is a viewer who was not having a great day and really liked the voicemail from the Eggman, or as he's now known, Steve Eggman. Eggman, if you are out there, I have to say thank you, man. I was just about on the edge of a mental breakdown today, and hearing that voicemail saved my life.
He does have a way of inspiring confidence, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And lastly, from our Reddit discussion forum, an interesting post called Perceptive Producer Pat Pounces, praising Perceptive Producer Pat who pounced, a lot of alliteration there, for pointing out that the racist lady from Trader Joe's had a cart with only avocados in it, something Pat found odd. And people in the audience reacting really strongly to that, Pat. They like it.
Well, I just think the fact that she had a cart full of just a few avocados really encapsulates her personality type as someone who's a bit deranged and inconsiderate of everyone else.
Yeah, I think that's clear, because why else would you take up the entire checkout lane with a cart if all you've got is 4 avocados? And I think the line of the segment was, what's she in a hurry to do? Make guacamole? And people really like that. So anyway, davidpakman.com/Reddit. Check it out. A lot of great discussions going on there. Let's talk a little bit about single-payer healthcare. Now that the American Health Care Act is moving through Congress, we're even more so concerned now that the state of healthcare in the U.S. could get much worse over the next few years, and it's already really, really bad. And a popular sort of pushback to that is we should be looking at single-payer healthcare. We should either take this as an opportunity to push universal health insurance or single-payer healthcare, or state-level single-payer healthcare, or something. So let's go through this and talk it through, okay? For anyone who doesn't know, first of all, single-payer healthcare is a system where everyone pays taxes into a single fund that finances everybody's healthcare, as opposed to paying people, paying premiums to health insurance companies, and then the health insurance companies decide what to cover at the providers. When you're talking about single payer, you're talking about circumventing the system of health insurance altogether. The government can take all the money that is paid in and either contract out to private service providers. That's how it's done in Canada's single payer system. Or the government can have their own medical facilities and employees. That's how it's done in the United Kingdom. There's really no one way that this is done, except for in the United States, we see a system that is different than in just about every other developed country. Every other developed country in the world has a single payer type system of one kind or another, okay? We actually were sort of going in this direction in the United States in the early 20th century. Wendell Potter, former Cigna executive, writes about this in his great book, Deadly Spin, and I've interviewed him about it. It ended up being scrapped. The U.S. was going in the direction of single payer. I think it was between World Wars I and II. And it was scrapped partially because it was too similar to what our enemy at the time, Germany, was doing. And instead, we went in the direction of this atrocious employer-connected for-profit health insurance system. Nowhere in the U.S. is there a single payer system in place, although you do have government-run healthcare when you look at programs like Medicare and Medicaid, although those are a little bit different. But there are possible state solutions for single-payer healthcare, which we will talk about. There's a couple of ways that this could be done. One is you could provide healthcare to all residents of a state, even though the federal government is going in the opposite direction. And Vermont looked at doing this, although it failed, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This could be something which could also, if it started in one state, maybe spread to other states if it went well. Now, it would require raising state taxes in the short run. That's going to be a hit on people's income. Most people, Pat, don't cheer when their taxes are going to go up. Even people who understand that taxes are there for a reason, it is very hard to pass significant tax increases. Yeah,
obviously people aren't going to cheer for higher taxes at first, but I think in a few years, once they realize how it works, they'll be more accustomed to the idea. And the fact that Social Security and Medicare gets taken out of your paychecks and they're popular systems, I think really goes to that idea.
California currently has a bill moving through its legislature that would set up a single-payer healthcare system in the state. The New York Health Act, which just passed the New York State Assembly and is 2 votes short of being passed in the Senate, would enroll every New Yorker in a state-run insurance program. As I mentioned, Vermont actually passed a bill in 2011 setting up a single-payer system, but the plan was abandoned in 2014 for a number of reasons, which I'll get into in a second. A handful of other states have introduced single-payer legislation. The bills have died somewhere in the process before being passed. Historically, single-payer systems save money. They obviously give people more coverage. They tend to create better health outcomes. But the biggest stigma surrounding single-payer is it increases taxes and it needs government employees. If you're in the mindset, Pat, of a small government, smaller government agencies, lower taxes, how on earth are you going to be convinced of this? I think you have to make a moral argument. That's the only way I could imagine convincing a small government conservative that this makes sense and saying, hey, the morality of the system we have is essentially nil, and we need to do something more moral.
That's why I think the state-by-state approach would be very effective, because that's how gay marriage came to be the law of the land.
Yeah.
That's how it was with marijuana. You see more and more states adding on to that. I think that's a good approach.
There's a strong case to be made for that. When Vermont walked away from its single-payer system in 2014, it was still in the process of being set up, and analyses showed that the system would have nearly doubled the state budget if fully implemented. So a single-payer system saves the government money. In the long term, it does have significant startup costs, and this is a challenge for individual states. Vermont would have needed to issue a $200 million bond to fully implement that system, and states have to abide by balanced budget laws. It's much harder for states to borrow money than it is for the federal government. So the alternative solution was you drastically raise taxes above the board, and that's very politically unpopular, as well as the reality that economies are cyclical. Healthcare demand is pretty constant, so tax revenue fluctuates. Healthcare spending would sort of stay the same. And in the beginning, if you're just raising this money, it can still create funding problems, which Vermont had. So I think, Pat, that we really need a federal single-payer system. It's much more financially viable, but it's just such a non-starter given the politicians we currently have in place.
I don't think that means that we shouldn't try, though, because as we see on a federal level, some politicians are pushing for H.R. 676, which would expand Medicare for all. The problem is, obviously, Republicans are not going to get in support of this, but some Democrats won't either. You have people like Dianne Feinstein who say that they're not ready to support single payer. You have Hillary Clinton who gave an applause line that single payer will never come to pass.
That's why Medicare for all, or the expansion of Medicare, is seen by many as a good direction to go, because you have the system in place. As I mentioned earlier, Medicare is a sort of single payer system. You can say, well, let's allow people to get into that system a little bit earlier. There's a mechanism to just say, hey, you can buy into Medicare, but then you could subsidize the cost to buy into Medicare at either the federal or state level. That's an approach that is increasingly being discussed. But when you've got a Republican House and a Republican Senate and a Republican president, it's hard to imagine that you're going to be able to do anything federally. And the problem is that because of the patchwork of federal and state laws, who's allowed to do what and when, it's going to be tough to do it at the state level.
It would definitely be tough to do right now, but I think looking towards 2020, there could be a resurgence of more progressive ideals when it comes to healthcare.
I hope so.
Because the Affordable Care Act didn't go far enough, and now you have the Republican replacement option, which is polling at anywhere from, I think, 17 to maybe 38%.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a demand for an alternative to those two systems, and what's the most popular system around the world? It's universal health care.
It is. And even within the U.S., Medicare is not a perfect system. It has its problems. But by and large, those who receive Medicare would not want to lose it in favor of the alternatives that are out there. The problem in the U.S. is mostly ideological, because as we've heard from professors like Gerald Friedman from my alma mater, the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, it's completely affordable. When you eliminate so many of the costs of the system we have and look at a single payer system, it's totally affordable. People are partisan and they're steeped in the private industry is better dogma. People like this. Take a look at this video clip.
With regard to the idea of whether or not you have a right to health care, you have to realize what that implies. It's not an abstraction. I'm a physician. That means you have a right to come to my house and conscript me. It means you believe in slavery. It means that you're going to enslave not only me, but the janitor at my hospital,
right,
the person who cleans my office.
The woman behind Rand Paul, if you were watching that, she, maybe that's just the expression she always has on her face, but she seemed genuinely perplexed by what Rand Paul was saying.
And Bernie Sanders responded to this by asking the healthcare professional who was testifying to that committee, do you feel like a slave? And the whole room there laughed at him.
The American Health Care Act is and will continue to be a disaster if it passes. The Affordable Care Act is a middle ground that hardly seems ideal to anyone, but you have people like Rand Paul who are willing to go as far as to say if healthcare is a right, doctors are slaves, which is hard for me to even really wrap my head around. And statistically, here and abroad, public health care is more popular with patients. You hear these anecdotal stories, Pat, about how, oh, in Canada, you've got to wait X number of months for Y procedure. There's no doubt that in any system, you are going to have individual cases where someone waited longer than what would be ideal. But overall, these systems work pretty well. There can be delays for elective procedures. There can be delays for non-urgent procedures. But by and large, people like their systems. And in all of these countries that have single-payer health care, if you don't like it, you can supplement your care with a private plan.
And people don't like this idea that we would be rationing care, but in this instance, we'd be rationing based off of the need that the person has.
Right.
Whereas now we're just rationing based off of how much money you have.
We have rationing now based on your ability to pay. There's no doubt about it, and we hear story after story after story pointing that out. You're completely right about that. And when you talk about, remember death panels, Sarah Palin's death panels from Obamacare? It's not true that Obamacare had death panels as described by Sarah Palin. But it's actually true that any system that is based on merely ability to pay is a form of death panel insofar as people will die due to lack of access to care. And I don't know how much further we have to go with the death panel thing. But bottom line, the system we have is immoral. The system, not everything has to be to make a profit. We can still be a capitalist society that says certain areas are not going to be left merely to for-profit companies. This includes, for example, the building of roads, uncontroversially. The military, I mean, yes, you've got these private mercenary groups that do government contracts, but the military is a socialist endeavor, so to speak. Education, yes, you can go to private schools, but we have public education. It's better in some places than in others. Healthcare. Healthcare need not be a product to be bought and sold.
And the government should be in charge of the institutions where it doesn't make sense to have a profit incentive for them. So as you mentioned, the military, roads, the police, and I think healthcare is first and foremost on that list.
Even with a socialist military, we've still figured out a way for contractors to make nice little profits working with the military. But yes, in principle, the military itself, as Pat points out, and as I pointed out, is on that list. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Susan Bordo, media critic, cultural historian, and feminist scholar. Her latest book is The Destruction of Hillary Clinton. Susan, it's so great to talk to you. And I found as I read the book, there's so much in the book that I agree with, but I also found that there were some aspects of what happened in the 2016 election that were just sort of not discussed in the book at all, and we'll get to that. So let's first lay it out sort of at the top level for our audience. What do you see as having been responsible for Hillary Clinton's loss in November?
Okay, it's a central question. Well, I think that probably what's different in my account from many of the other accounts that are currently dominant is I see it as multifactorial. I think there's no one thing that made the difference. I think there are a number of things that all together contributed to what I call a massive pylon that made Comey's final announcement something that she couldn't get over. In other words, it was not the absolutely decisive event, but it was fatal because of everything that had gone before. And that includes stuff during the primary. It included the way the media reported her. It included a lot of, undercurrents of long-standing gender ideas that inevitably crept in. It included the email scandal, the Russian interference. There's so much that impacted that election that it's impossible to come up with one factor that was decisive.
When you look at the primary of the Democratic Party, which involved not only Bernie Sanders, but also the Democratic National Committee, which we now know was actively working to help Hillary Clinton be the eventual nominee, what's your assessment there of how that impacted the eventual election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton?
Well, I think that it had a residue that was extremely important. And the residue was to have branded Hillary Clinton in a certain way that had a tremendous impact, especially on young people who, for completely legitimate reasons had not lived through certain events and who were more dependent upon Bernie Sanders and his surrogates to define Hillary for them. And I think that he defined her in certain ways that, though they began really pretty innocuously, they began to tip over at a certain point in the primary into something very close to the she's a criminal that we heard from the right wing. So there was a kind of melding of the left and right branding of Hillary that I think was very powerful.
Let's explore that in a little more detail if we can. I mean, so I'm thinking back to the primary, and I remember you had Hillary Clinton and the DNC both working to basically keep attention off of Bernie Sanders as much as possible. This included the scheduling of very few debates. This including the scheduling of debates Sunday nights on 3 days. Well, hold on. I'll give you a chance to tell me where I'm wrong. This included the scheduling of debates on Sunday nights on 3-day weekends when many people would be traveling. Really anything that could be done to give as little attention to anyone other than Hillary Clinton as possible. But your sense is that Hillary Clinton was actually the one who was damaged by the primary. Help me understand that.
Okay, yeah, I will. Well, first of all, Bernie Sanders, one of the things, the DNC is one issue. And I absolutely agree that the DNC was behind Hillary Clinton.
Okay, good.
I might not agree on the specifics of it. I think that the number of debates that were scheduled were equivalent to the number of debates that have been scheduled in the past. I think that the particulars that the DNC were charged with don't always hold up. But let's get past the particulars.
Well, I want to, on my show, I like to, when an assertion is made, I want to follow it through. Which particular assertion about the DNC that has been made do you find to have been not true?
Okay, well, let's take the idea that, which I agree with, that the DNC was behind Hillary Clinton and ask why. If that's the case, why? Bernie Sanders wasn't a Democrat to begin with. He was an independent. Hillary Clinton had a long history of working cooperatively and collaboratively with members of the Democratic Party, which Bernie didn't have. So she had a history of relationships. I mean, the way it has been presented, the way I think a lot of Bernie people took it was there was this conspiracy against him.
Well, no, I don't think we have to go to conspiracy, but what you said is basically because of Hillary Clinton's historical relationship with the people running the DNC, that's why the DNC wanted her to win. Isn't that the definition of cronyism?
You could call it cronyism, or you could call it, decades of working together with people in a way that allowed them to feel listened to, included, that allowed them to feel that this was a leader that would be able to embrace a large tent. Bernie, for all that he has many sterling qualities, has no record of being able to do that.
Is that true, though? I mean, dating all the way back to being a mayor in Vermont, being in the House of Representatives and all of the committees he participated in there, being a senator. I mean, certainly there's, on paper, fewer candidates that were more qualified than Hillary Clinton. I was one of the first to admit it. I mean, her record, whether you agree or disagree with her views, it's hard to find someone with more experience than Hillary Clinton, but to call Bernie Sanders inexperienced also doesn't really seem right. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's been in politics for 50 years.
Yeah, he's establishment, which of course he did not ever own. He's been in politics, for decades and decades and decades. But in terms of him spearheading efforts in the Senate, now I can't speak to him as mayor of Vermont. I cannot speak to he may have been a fabulous mayor, but in terms of his ability to work in the larger arena of Congress, he doesn't have a very distinguished record. Now, I don't think that disqualifies him, but I do think that when you look at Hillary's record, people knew her. They knew her as someone they could work with. They knew her as someone who they could pass bills with. Bernie ran as, you can't have it both ways. You can't both run as an outsider and at the same time claim that you are just as respected and have just as good a record of working with people as your so-called establishment candidate.
Well, in terms of being respected, he did have a higher favorability rating than Hillary Clinton, so at least some people did respect him more, right?
Well, wait, by whom? I thought we were talking about people in Congress now. If we're moving to talk about the public, Bernie was never tried. Hillary was the target. She was the person to beat. She was the person that the GOP from the very beginning felt they had to take down. If Bernie had ever gotten himself in a position, nothing bad was ever, think about the onslaught of faux scandals and nasty epithets and the way Hillary was dragged through the mud. You can go back farther than just this election.
Yeah, although Bernie also, think Bernie was fighting in a way against both Hillary and the DNC. When the leaked emails revealed that Clinton staffers and DNC staffers were thinking of making Bernie's lack of religion an issue, that's pretty low, right? That's pretty bad to be going on within the Democratic Party.
Bernie himself said, and I'm sorry, I can't quote it exactly because I don't have my book in front of me, that everything that they found in the DNC emails, they would find similar things in their campaign emails had they looked in them. Bernie himself, it was Bernie's surrogates and followers who were so upset about those emails. Bernie himself said, this goes on in campaigns all the time. People do opposition research. They're ready to come up with dirt. And in fact, the Republicans, I shudder as a Jew. I shudder to think of what would have happened if the GOP had gotten their hands on Bernie Sanders. We even saw anti-Semitic overtones in their attacks on Hillary, with those posters with dollar signs.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, and as someone who's Jewish myself, but believe me, I'm fully following every aspect of that line of reasoning that you're suggesting. So to sort of put a fine point on the DNC part, You initially said you sort of understand why the DNC would help Hillary Clinton, but then you've also said that it sounds like to me that you don't actually think that what the DNC did really had that much of a impact in hurting Bernie Sanders. So what's your what's your net assessment of what the DNC did?
What they did in terms of supporting Hillary?
Yes, even though they claim to be an unbiased arbiter of the primary, we know they were helping Hillary Clinton. What's your sort of net assessment of that?
Well, I ultimately, Deborah Wasserman Schultz, quit or was asked to resign.
Yeah.
So I think the DNC ultimately owned that they had at least one person who had behaved in inappropriate ways. I think that on net balance, when you look at what was going for Hillary and what was going for Bernie in the primary now, I think that what the DNC did for Hillary was, it's apples and oranges. It's very hard to compare because what Bernie had going for him was not the establishment support that Hillary had going for her. But what he had was an election. How can I put this? This election, both in terms of the Republicans and also the Democrats, really favored the candidates who could spellbind a crowd, the candidates who could be photographed at mass rallies, the candidates who spoke in, one-line bursts that were electrifying. And both Bernie and Trump, in his way, were that kind of campaigner. Hillary, by her own admission, is not. She said herself, I really don't like speechifying. I like serving. And in fact, when Hillary has been a servant as opposed to a campaigner, her approval ratings have been higher than Bernie's ever were. We like and you can argue that there's a little bit of gender stuff going on there. We are comfortable with women when they are in service positions, when they seem to be too ambitious, right? It becomes strident. It turns people off. And the very style, I think, that Bernie electrified people with would not have gone over well with Hillary. At the same time, Hillary's own style was not favored. So I think that, she was at a lot of disadvantages, even without getting into the way the press treated her and the GOP and the lock her up and the phony email scandal. And in my book, I prove, that's completely, she neither lied. I'm not, I know some people have called this book just a kind of idolatry of Hillary. And I admire her a great deal. Yeah. And part of the reason I think why the book may come off that way is because what we've seen is this orgy of Hillary blaming. And my feeling was, this is just way out of proportion. I could write a book in which I said, okay, on the one hand, Hillary did this wrong, and on the other hand, she did this wrong. But everybody was doing the blaming for me, right? Yeah. And so I think that, in fact, the scales were really unfairly tipped against her, even given the establishment support that she had during the primary.
Well, there's so much more we could talk about. Unfortunately, we are beyond our time, and I hope to have you back. Certainly more disagreements I would love to talk with you about, but I think it's an interesting conversation nonetheless. We've been speaking with Susan Bordo, who's author of the book, The Destruction of Hillary Clinton. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, David. I've enjoyed it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Here's an interesting little sub-story to the firing of FBI Director James Comey on Tuesday. CBS News' Eliza Palmer was rinkside, yes, rinkside, and asked Vladimir Putin about the firing of FBI Director James Comey. Why rinkside? Well, Vladimir Putin was in a full hockey uniform with pads and about to participate in a hockey game. His response was very odd. The entire thing is pretty surreal, and I'm going to play it for you. If you're listening on the radio or podcast and not watching, you're going to hear a third voice in addition to Putin's and the CBS reporters, which is the interpreter who is bridging the language gap between Putin and Eliza Palmer. There's also music blaring in the background during this. I mean, everything about this is surreal. Okay, let's take a look.
Nice to meet you. Sir, how will the firing of James Comey affect U.S.-Russia relations?
Как вы влияет на двусторонние отношения?
Увольнение?
Увольнение.
Да никак не повлияет.
There will be no effect.
Ваш вопрос выглядит, вы меня не сердитесь, пожалуйста, он выглядит смешным для меня.
Your question looks very funny for me. Don't be angry with me.
Мы не имеем к этому никакого отношения.
We have nothing to do with that.
Президент Трамп действует в рамках своей компетенции.
President Trump
Конституции и законов.
is acting in accordance with his competence and in accordance with his law and constitution.
Мы здесь при чем?
And what about us? Why we?
Я вот видите, в хоккей собираюсь играть с любителями.
You see, I'm going to play hockey with the hockey fans.
И вас приглашаю.
And I invite you to do the same.
I'll be here and I'll be watching. Thank you very much.
Мы будем обязательно смотреть. Спасибо.
Eliza Palmer should absolutely have accepted the invitation to join Vladimir Putin's hockey game. That's a major journalistic opportunity there.
Yeah, and why so defensive there? You know, she was asking how would this affect Russia and U.S. relations, and he responded by saying, oh, we had nothing to do with it. That's not what she asked.
It's very strange. It's a very strange response. Her questions looked funny to Putin. Putin has to be laughing at the U.S. big time, right? I mean, he's attacked our voting system. He's arguably helped get a major clown elected president, a clown that's disrupting our entire government for fear of being exposed as having colluded potentially with Russia. Vladimir Putin's got to be laughing all the way to, as I like to say, the bank, given his alleged $200 billion net worth.
And in that hockey game that followed, he apparently scored 6 or 7 goals. So even at 64 years old playing against ex-NHL stars, he's doing quite well for himself.
When I hear Putin scored 7 goals, I am reminded of when Kim Jong-il got 9 holes in one when he played golf. The difference being Putin really did it. But obviously, is this because it's a competitive game and Putin's really good at hockey the way that Kim Jong-il was supposedly really good at golf? I know it's not exactly the same thing, but it reminds me of that. Needless to say, isn't this one of the strangest videos you've seen lately?
Yeah, and credit to that reporter because, as we know, Russia does not have the best reputation when it comes to dealing with journalists.
Right.
So there's some bravery there.
Paul Ryan was at Success Academy Charter School in Harlem, New York earlier this week. And as he was leaving, he was hilariously booed and people chanted healthcare for all, not just Paul, as well as FU. And there were many of those FU chants. The entire Trump Care, American Health Care Act, Obamacare repeal fiasco is an ever-growing fiasco, truly. Here's video from independent video journalist Sandy Backham, and not a friend in the crowd for Paul Ryan here. Right. How does Paul Ryan keep that bizarre smile on his face the entire time as an entire city block is booing him? He comes out and waves. Maybe he misheard the booing and profanity as cheers.
Yeah, or maybe he was being sarcastic, I guess. Just get in the car and go.
Yeah, and Paul Ryan, the thing about Paul Ryan and his relationship to healthcare policy is that he's obviously involved directly in this totally abortive bill, but he's also a huge hypocrite. He relied on Social Security benefits as a teen when his father passed away. Arguably, government welfare programs are responsible for keeping Paul Ryan on his feet, helping him to pay for college, getting him to where he is today. He's worked in the public sector for decades, having his salary paid by taxpayer dollars, yet at any opportunity, he wants to take away systematically any social welfare dollars that he can from average people. And if Trump and Pence get impeached, you know who our president is, Pat?
Paul Ryan.
Paul Ryan. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, with a country of 300 million people, you can find a crowd of people who are going to boo any particular policy or politician. But the thing is here, it's not the exception, it's the rule, because their healthcare bill is polling anywhere from 17 to 38%.
Yes.
And Paul Ryan is in charge of a Congress that has a 20% approval rating.
On that note, will the AHA, call it what you will it take down Republicans in the midterms? There's actually a risk here, and it's pretty clear that more reasonable House Republicans get it, despite voting in favor of this bill. They all had the sense to decline the MSNBC invitation on Joy Reid's program to explain why they voted for it. It's so unpopular that it's not worth appearing in public to defend it. And Senate Republicans seem to be closer to reality on this. It's going to be hard to find something that both Senate Republicans will agree with, along with the most extreme House Republicans. That's what it'll take to pass this, and I don't know if it'll happen.
And of course, the Congressional Budget Office hasn't yet assessed this, and many of those congressmen, when they give the interviews, say they didn't read it.
Yeah.
So I'm sure Paul Ryan's going to be against this, because in 2009 he said, I don't think we should pass bills when we haven't read them and we don't know what they cost.
I'm glad you brought that up, because earlier in the week we said it was sort of set up so that members of Congress, members of the House, wouldn't have time to read the health care bill. I later found out, is this true? It's only a 66-page bill?
Yeah, but there was amendments added onto it.
66 pages actually isn't a lot to read in 3 days. So I kind of want to amend my prior comment about it. When I sit down and read a nonfiction book, if I read for an hour, depending on the book, it's about a minute per page.
Yeah.
Or a little more, right? You're talking about 45 to 60 pages an hour. If you have 3 days and 20% of the American economy is connected to healthcare, you actually do have the time and should have the motivation to read 66 pages, maybe have the amendments summarized by staff, but you can read 66 pages.
And of course, this isn't light reading, because there's a lot of legalese style text in there. You're making a policy proposal.
Even then, 3 minutes per page. You can still do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you think, Pat, that the tax plan and maybe even the Obamacare repeal and replacement will be delayed because of the James Comey fiasco, and it'll just slow down everything that's going on?
I think Democrats will use that as a reason to slow those things down, but ultimately they'll get to the floor.
Would maybe Republicans also focus on other things? I don't know. I got a lot of emails from people yesterday saying the tax plan is definitely slowing down, and maybe even the AHA. We'll see. That Comey fiasco is not going away anytime soon. We've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to this voicemail.
Hey, guys. Listen, I like to confront Trump supporters and get them going here at work, but they're all really too stupid. But my boss is relatively the smartest one. So I go to him and I show him, hey, Sally Yates, James Comey, Russia, give me an excuse, right? And my boss says, they're all crooked. Every politician is crooked. Everyone in D.C. is crooked. None would ever care. So when an educated Trump voter finally realizes they're totally effed and they voted for the wrong person and they know he's crooked, their answer is, they're all crooked. Hillary's crooked. Everyone's crooked. Republicans, Democrats, you guys come across this where people, they know they're in a corner and everyone's bad.
Oh, yeah.
Like Trump. They're all the same. Nobody cares.
Total cognitive dissonance.
Excuse ever.
Yeah. The Eggman there checking in. Total cognitive dissonance, which is you talk about how great a politician is. As soon as they do something bad, you say, well, they all do it. This is what's called the defeasibility test, which is, well, okay, you like this politician. What would make you change your mind about them? Oh, if they did something bad. When they do that bad thing, they say, well, no, my mind hasn't been changed because every politician does this and they're a politician after all. It's a logical fallacy.
And I think that argument is going to be acceptable to some people when it comes to any other politician. But the whole appeal behind Donald Trump was that he wasn't a politician and, you know, he berated everyone else for being all talk, no action. He was supposed to be the champion for changing the system.
Right. If at any point you fall back on, well, all politicians do whatever it is Trump is doing, you in great part voted for him because he wasn't going to be like every other politician. So it's a direct contradiction to a campaign promise that at least influenced you partially. Yeah, I feel for the Eggman. And fortunately, I don't have that many conversations like that in my regular life.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty combative there.
Yeah.
I get that.
You involved in conversations like that with frequency?
Not with too much frequency.
That's good. Yeah,
you know?
I recommend avoiding them because it's pretty toxic. On the bonus show today, the French dislike Donald Trump even more than they dislike Vladimir Putin, the Chinese president, and the German chancellor. A fistfight erupted on a Southwest Airlines flight. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, Pat, about my experiences with Southwest Airlines.
And fistfights?
And fistfights as well, sure. Also, Amazon is building a large building in Seattle. Half of that building is going to be turned into a homeless shelter administered by a local charity that runs a series of shelters. Is it a great thing? Is it just an attempt to get positive PR? Is it both? Is it neither? I think those are the four possible combinations. Yes. We will discuss these stories and more on today's bonus show. You can sign up and get instant access to the members-only bonus show by becoming a member at davidpakman.com/membership. And of course, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Speak to you on the bonus show. Don't miss it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.